Well, now when you're sitting there in your silk upholstered chair, talking to some rich folks that you know, well, I hope you don't see me in my ragged company. All that you know, I could never be alone. Take me down, little Susie, take me down. I know you think you're the queen of the underground. Send me dead flowers every morning. Send me dead flowers by the maid. Send me dead flowers to my wedding.
Howdy, folks. Your host, Double J, back here, coming at you live from my studio/RV dining room, located directly outside the city of Little Port-au-Prince, formerly known as Springfield, Ohio. Now, thanks for joining us here, folks of the interwebs. Once again, Double J here. We'll be your pilot and navigator for this shenanigan-infused journey into the mind of this particular garbage can dude. And we have a real dandy of a conversation here on deck for you folks this evening. Got my co-host over here, Nick from the Occult Rejects, and our guests, Recluse and Dr. Inferno. We're going to be discussing the film, kind of a film review of the Stoner Noir genre, which, is a very kind of specific genre of the crime noir Hollywood films. Essentially, it's a man, a mystery, and typically marijuana, but not necessarily. Some other intoxicant, though, is involved in the solving of the mystery, perhaps, if you will. Maybe even aiding in the solving of that mystery. Who knows? But yeah, so I really kind of learned about this from listening to a podcast with Recluse and Dr. Inferno here, and thought it'd be great to dive into the subject more, because some of these films are some of my favorite films, and the genre, kind of as a whole, quite honestly. But we're going to get into that conversation, but we'll turn it over here to my co-host this evening here, Nick from the Occult Rejects. Nick, want to give us a quick introduction here before turn over to our guests here and learn more about the crime noir genre?
Sure. Thank you very much, even for having me back on again. Always have a great time. Well, tons of laughs.
Yeah. Oh, every time, man, for sure. And obviously, as a stoner noir, and you yourself being a stoner, I had to invite you.
For sure. I think even when we met in Washington, I think I pulled out a joint that I rolled up, and you were like, "Oh, this is a log." You said something like, "Oh, it's a big one."
Yeah, well, it's America, and that's our nation's capital, so it is the proper way to respect
it. But yeah, thanks for having me on, man. I'm even still thinking about Harry Houdini and smoking crack. So, I mean, that was a blast. But yeah, you can. I'm from the Occult Rejects. It's a podcast with probably, at this point, it's probably got like 8 to 10 maybe people that I really consider part of the podcast. I get a bunch of different like roundtables or panels of people for different topics. That's on YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, and all major podcasts. For people, it's more, if you've never heard of it before, it's much more focused on the occult. Sometimes we'll do like true crime or some other things, but the occult is normally still in there somehow, and we talk about like magic and other things as well. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's some really good true crime shows we've done there on the Occult Rejects. Really got into a lot of the subjects that are popular amongst the true crime community. Idaho 4, Delphi stuff, obviously the Smiley Face Killers. I think really offer a different approach in our analysis. So I really can't make those up enough.
That is like a really good point to mention, and it's not even like I just find it funny how like even like with people like on Twitter that I know, when it comes to like Smiley Face Killers or the Idaho 4 with us, I find it interesting how a podcast that isn't true crime especially like mine. I mean, it's really the occult, and like I wouldn't consider
Sure.
you just true crime, or Ron just true crime. You know what I'm saying? So like
Sure.
we're known for putting out decent work on in a genre that's really not ours. Like, what does that say about the
Right.
true crime community?
We dabble in true crime, is what you're saying.
Yeah, no, it's just kind of
Yeah.
funny how like two shows that really aren't known for that actual thing, like that's not what they are, somehow put out better work than people who do.
Yeah, that's a fair point, but I think your interest in true crime as well as mine is going to play into our topic here tonight with
Oh hell yeah!
Stoner Noir. And I thanks for the introduction there, Nick, and Recluse. I appreciate you joining us here this evening. You're really the one that kicked off some of this. You and Dr. Inferno, they're really the ones that kicked off the Stoner Noir topic for me here. And author and host of the Farm Mach 2 podcast, Recluse. Thanks for joining us here, bud.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It's always fun to talk Stoner Noir. As we were sort of talking about earlier, it's kind of a nice change of subjects from some of the darker things that Doc and I normally talk about. So
sure,
do this on the farm. So yeah, it's hopefully it'll be a good chat here tonight too.
Definitely gonna be a parapolitical discussion. You know, every time I think we talk, you and I talk, and often conversations I have with Nick and Dr. Inferno, not just about the parapolitical topics, but how they relate to the plot lines and narratives of Hollywood films. Specifically, that'll be on our topic of conversation here tonight with Stoner Noir.
Let me interject this. One of the more interesting things I think that came out of that episode, I don't want to make this totally about the episode that me and Recluse did, but
well, let me give you a proper introduction here, Doctor. Dr. Inferno, host of the Demented Warrior podcast, can be heard on numerous episodes of Operation GCD and the Farm. But please, Doctor, what's your prescription here?
Okay, thank you. One of the more interesting things I think that came out of that I didn't know about is some of the Shane Black films. They really do cover a lot of ground when it comes to the parapolitical, and you wouldn't think, for just being a action kind of writer or an action director. Which I like to say he's like more of a cerebral type of action director, not to be pretentious or anything, but I think out of all like the action directors, all the people that direct action, he has masterfully kind of combined sort of the John Woo type, let's just say stunt action with, mystery elements, kind of neo-noir elements, and also parapolitical elements too as well. One of the things that came out is like before doing that episode, I didn't have an appreciation for The Last Boy Scout. But Recluse talked about some of the rigging that went into the NFL, and I think we were talking beforehand. One of my favorite,
lot of rigging. If I may interject, a lot of rigging.
Yeah. Lots of rigging. And this is something that sort of is going to, I think, play a big part in the future. With like now we have legalized gambling. You think it would probably take that down, but I think honestly, with the legalized gambling and organized sports, you're going to see more of an uptick of like organized crime ramped up, right? Getting involved. Yeah, I think it's going to be more revved up. And what's interesting is previously I was talking about Aaron Hernandez. He's like one of my favorite like NFL players for obvious reasons. He's
what are those obvious reasons? Because he was a gangster.
He was a gangster, yeah. He was a gangster. Yeah. I'm just saying. I think he probably wasn't a good person per se. He's just an interesting character. No, not a great person, but he's just an interesting all-around kind of character, and the way like he relates to the NFL. I think he probably had a lot of insight into like the rigging of the NFL.
Oh,
I just wanted to add that to before we we go on to talk about Stoner Noir.
That was kind of the plot line of like one of the underlying plot lines of The Last Boy Scout, right? Was the
that was one of the
what was that 1992 or 1993? What are we talking about?
I think it was even earlier, like 91.
91. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Well, yeah. No, that's an interesting point, Doc. I mean, I hadn't really thought about that, but I mean, especially with the Patriots, there was the Super Bowl that they had a couple of years after Hernandez had gone down. I think they were playing the Eagles or something, and it was such like a bizarre thing because this was a particular year where New England's secondary was just awful aside from this one cornerback. I can't remember like what his name was off the top of my head, but it was like supposedly because he had missed a curfew or something like that, they benched him like for the entire Super Bowl, which is just like unheard of. I mean, I've never heard of just like a player, like a star, like cornerback being benched like this. I mean, because he missed a freaking curfew or something like that. And they never really talked about like any of the circumstances around it either. Belichick was just really strange in how like he approached the press about that. I mean, he essentially refused to talk about the decision and what have you. And that was like one of the times where it just almost seemed like, you know, the call had gone in. You know, they were taking a dive for that game, and Belichick was just like, all right, you want me to take a dive? Well, I'm going to do something that's going to get everybody wondering what the fuck is going on by just benching this guy for this absurd reason. So, yeah, in light of like what had happened with Hernandez, man, you got to wonder about some of the politics that were going on with the Patriots during this era.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and also,
that's
like the
point,
whole
especially
scandal
with the Patriots. They're obviously they're the moneymaker, right? So I mean, that's why they're making a Netflix. Was it Netflix documentary on Aaron Hernandez? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
I mean, that's and it's not they're not making that about a Chris Henry, the wide receiver hoodlum from the Cincinnati Bengals.
No.
You know what I mean?
No. Also, like the whole scandal behind the the healthcare and like the concussions, and probably that they weren't taking proper care of the NFL players. That was kind of like brought open with like Aaron Hernandez. So, like I said, that's like one of the more interesting points I think from that episode that me and Recluse did is I didn't know that really the NFL or like organized sports was that rigged or that connected to like the mafia. I always been skeptical of that, but
it was
I think
started by
Shane
the
Black.
mafia.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting.
No,
how
literally,
much
like you look at teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers or the New York Giants, the Rooney family, the Steeler owners, and the Mara family, the Giants owners. They both were involved. Both these families were involved in mob operations and organized crime operations and gambling, right? Before they became NFL owners. These were concerns early on when they became. These were some of the original owners, right? And some of their kids are in Hollywood. Like one of the granddaughters, those families have intermarried. One of the granddaughters is an actress named Rooney Mara. So I mean, these families, there's it's a whole network when you get into these NFL teams. Their connections, the Hilton family, they used to own the Chargers. It's in like Paris Hilton's uncle, I think it is. There's a lot of crossover to Hollywood. And before we get too far into this discussion, that's a great point you brought up there, Doctor, about the Last Boy Scout. It's probably my least favorite Shane Black film, but Shane Black's clearly the
mine would be Last Action Hero. I did not like that film. I can appreciate it now, but when I watched it when I was younger, I said this kind of sucks. But I kind of get what the point. It's like a meta story about like action films and kind of like a parody or satire.
Yeah, satire.
I get it now.
But before we get too far into the topic here, Recluse, can you help us out with defining what exactly is Stoner Noir? I mean, I gave a quick rough estimation of it: the man, the mystery, and the marijuana, or other intoxicant, if you will. But what is the official kind of definition of what a Stoner Noir film genre is?
Well, I mean, there's really no, official definition per se. Roughly speaking, I mean, how far back the genre goes in and of itself is a matter of debate. But I mean, generally, most people focus on The Long Goodbye, I think it was the 1973 adaptation done by by Robert Altman of Raymond Chandler. And so for those of you unfamiliar, Raymond Chandler was, along with Dashiell Hammett, essentially the quintessential private detective novelist. He wrote The Big Sleep, which was famously adapted into the Humphrey Bogart film with Lauren Bacall that was such a huge hit back in the day. So this was kind of a celebrated adaptation at the time, and it was coming out at a point when there was a big revival for private detective films. I mean, you had just had Chinatown by Polanski, which was quite successful, for instance. So Altman did this, but he took a very, very different approach than what Polanski had done with Chinatown. Whereas Polanski had done a pretty conventional take on the private detective genre as far as it goes, Altman essentially did almost a postmodern take on it. I mean, this sort of stoic, private detective Philip Marlowe that Raymond Chandler had created for his novels is really reduced to this befumbling fool. Of course, Marlowe was sort of an arch, waspy type figure. In the film, he's played by the obviously Jewish Elliot Gould. As I said,
he plays a wasp in the film, huh?
Yeah. I mean, as as Doc and I talk about, at the beginning of the movie, he's literally being bossed around by his cat.
He's very schlubby. Very
yeah,
schlubby.
he ends up having to go out at like 3 a.m. to get cat food for his cat who won't leave him alone. Even then, he gets the wrong cat food, and the cat walks out on him. I mean, he's just totally out of step the entire movie. He's practically a joke. He's not a stoner or anything like that, but he is totally inept, which I think is a crucial component of it. But regardless, The Long Goodbye proved to be an extremely influential film. I mean, you really can't imagine later films like The Big Lebowski or Inherent Vice without it. It wouldn't surprise me who's the novelist who did Inherent Vice? Gosh,
Pynchon.
Yeah,
most likely Pynchon did.
I would imagine Pynchon probably was a big fan of The Long Goodbye. I mean, of course, he was living in LA during this whole era where it would have been set. So
that's a good point. I was gonna say the same thing. Yeah, he would have been around this time. He'd been writing Inherent Vice.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, he didn't do Inherent Vice until later.
No, I didn't write Inherent Vice until like 2009.
Right. What I meant was the elements that he wrote into Inherent Vice. He was living in LA through those elements at that time. Is what I meant.
Yeah, exactly.
Good point. He didn't publish it until much later, but yeah, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with this film, but I'm certainly going to watch it. The way y'all describe it as kind of a baseline to the genre is interesting to me because I would almost think that Chinatown almost kind of falls into this. Is that more of just a full-on noir film?
I would describe Chinatown, as more of a conventional one. I mean, Doc and I had talked about essentially like what defines a stoner noir film because obviously there's no real definition, and I came up with 2 potential characteristics of one. So the first is that it's got to have some kind of a detective story. The protagonist doesn't have to be a detective per se, but they've got to be trying to solve some type of mystery. And the second is the detective has to be a buffoon to some extent or another. And that's where I would say Chinatown sort of doesn't really pass the test. I mean, Nicholson's obviously not the greatest on-screen private detective, but he's not fuck up either. Like, again, Elliot Gould's Philip Marlowe or some of the other people that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, or the Lebowski doesn't have that quite buffoonery aspect to him.
I would also add 2 more elements too. Paranoia and also antagonism, usually with like authority figure, like a cop or with some kind of system.
Well, I would say though, you almost always have antagonism though against police officers.
That's true.
Detective. I mean, again,
Nicholson's got that in Chinatown,
like Raymond Chandler's works. Dashiell Hammett, obviously. I mean, he had worked for the Americans at one point, so there's a very, very anti-police vibe in a lot of his novels. So I don't know that necessarily is like a distinct characteristic of a story.
Let me qualify what I mean by that. Usually what I mean is that in the case of even like The Long Goodbye, usually the authority figure is kind of seen as someone that represents kind of counterculture. And the same thing is true about Inherent Vice too. They're usually kind of straight-laced, kind of even conservative type cop motifs and archetypes that you see in these types of stories. I would say, that's not necessarily, that's an element found in all noir, except for like Roman noir. Roman noir is like kind of more from the perspective of like the criminal, and sometimes detectives don't even figure in that. It's more kind of atmospheric, kind of like in Jim Thompson's stories. But I would say also paranoia and kind of anxiety figure very heavily into like stoner noir, even though there is like lighthearted elements found in all of these that kind of oversight the other more darker elements that's usually in noir. But I would say like the paranoia is usually heightened in most cases. But didn't mean to interject here, but I just wanted to interject. I think those are good.
I would very strongly agree with the paranoia aspect too. I mean, I think that this is One of the reasons, too, why a surprising number of stoner noir films end up bringing in a lot of like political conspiracy theories and stuff like that. I mean, again, obviously, most noir films, I mean, there's a certain atmosphere of paranoia, but I would agree with Doc, it's totally different in a good stoner noir film. There's often a lot of parapolitical intrigues that are playing out in them, much more so than you would see in a conventional private detective movie. Another possible like sub-characteristic you could throw in would be LA itself. Most of the top stoner noir films are set in Los Angeles, and even those that aren't necessarily set in LA typically reflect the culture of LA, I would argue, to some extent or other. So I suppose that would maybe be another characteristic you could possibly throw in there as well.
Interesting. Okay. Well,
and I would say
I didn't include it in tonight's lineup of films we're going to discuss, but while you all are describing these characteristics of what is a stoner noir, I would think maybe the film From Hell,
especially beach, also beach surroundings would figure prominently in, and maybe even like surf culture, like in Inherent Vice.
Sure.
Believe it or not, surf culture even itself has, or Lebowski has a lot of like criminal undertones. Believe it or not, I mean, it's not just that movie Point Break, but I mean there were like surfer kind of gangs and surfer like, yeah, there were like surfer gangs. There were like surfer people that were planning like not just bank robberies, but like just organized like crime types that probably
stuff.
Even like
that's like the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, essentially. I mean, they really
there you go.
Surfers.
They're usually surfer bros.
Drug
surfer bros figure like very
commonly. Surfer gang, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so what do y'all think about the film From Hell? Would that qualify as a stoner noir film? The Johnny Depp, Jack the Ripper. Okay, immediately no.
No, that's a period piece.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, I would have to. I don't know that necessarily it being a period piece would disqualify it. I mean, granted, there hasn't really been like a prompt, but then again, I mean, technically, Inherent Vice is a period piece.
Yeah.
Sure.
Actually, Big Lebowski was theoretically a period piece.
The Nice Guys.
It was only like 5, but I mean, it still was. I mean, so yeah, I mean, a lot of actually the classic stoner noir films usually are set in the 70s. Inherent Vice, Nice Guys. So I don't know that it being a period piece would necessarily disqualify it. I mean, that's a really interesting one to raise because it does have the air of paranoia. You do have the sort of
big time.
Even though I would say Johnny Depp's detective, is, at least, even though he's definitely high for most of the film, he's semi-competent.
He's kind of bumbling at times. He's kind of bumbling.
It's like maybe a variation of like stoner noir and the occult detective subgenre. Because we got into sort of the how you could sort of combine science fiction with stoner noir with something like Strange Days or Scanner Darkly. So I don't really see.
Scanner Darkly. Yeah, that's a good one.
Genre either.
Yeah, no, it's a great one. Scanner Darkly specifically.
I can see that.
Nick, what are your thoughts? Have you seen this film, The Long Goodbye, or you got any thoughts on the From having a kind of stoner noir, crime noir? You seen that one? They kind of blamed the Freemasons, I think, with the whole.
I thought that was great. I actually, I think I covered that by myself on the occult.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. It's. I thought that was. When you mentioned that, I was like, I could see that for sure. But I mean,
he does the opium. He's got the absinthe, as Doctor pointed out there. He's got the opium. He got prescribed the opium, and then he's got the absinthe at times, I believe. So he's definitely hallucinating. He's got some big time paranoia aspects. Definitely the bumbling. He's got some bumbling aspects.
And a mystery.
Character. Yeah.
So
he's got the mystery. He doesn't have surfers at the beach because it's London. And
I mean, what was that, Stephen? Too. I mean, I could see a lot of. Potentially in the future, you could really have a lot of fun with, sort of combining the occult detective and the stoner noir genres, because I'm a big fan of occult detective stuff too. Again, I love Angel Heart, Lord of Illusions. I mean, a lot of that kind of stuff. So there's definitely, I think, some fun ways you could go with that.
Angel Heart's underrated.
I think that's one of the at least it was some of the salient characteristics that I enjoyed about True Detective, right? He's a cold kind of stoner noir series, right? That would kind of qualify here, right? Minus the surfboards and the beaches, but you got.
I think Russ is pretty competent, though. I mean, even though he's fucked up for most of the film, he's more, I would think, kind of like a conventional, like hard-boiled detective.
So that would fall just a cult crime detective film.
I would say True Detectives maybe a little more of just like straight up
noir.
detective.
Yeah, he's not very bumbling. You're right. Yeah, you're definitely right on that aspect. Dude's pretty hardcore. Well, I think I'm definitely going to check out The Long Goodbye because I'm interested in it. I'm not familiar with it, but again, this genre is I'm a big fan of it, including
before we go off that one, one thing that's interesting about that particular film is they used a technique called flashing. This is like a specific technique to make the film give the person kind of the illusion that they were like in an altered kind of state and in a like high state. So that's a little interesting technique that I learned about while researching The Long Goodbye. They use like this specific technique the choreographer did to make it seem like the characters and like the people that were interacting with the audience were like stoned.
Was it lighting? Was it cameras? What are we talking about? How did they?
Yeah, we're choreography. Yes, like the film stock.
It kind of reminds me a bit of Point Blank. I don't know if you guys saw that. It was a John Borman movie with Lee Marvin. It's really really good. They actually kind of remade it with Mel Gibson as Payback. I think that came back out in like 1999 or something. The Point Blank is freaking amazing. It came out in the late 60s and it has a really, really like psychedelic, trippy atmosphere to it. Essentially, it's about this gangster played by Lee Marvin who's left for dead at Alcatraz, and he somehow inexplicably survives by swimming from the prison to the shore in San Francisco after he's been shot multiple times. And it effectively follows him as he's going around San Francisco, trying to get the money back that was stolen from him. But it definitely captures the whole atmosphere of San Francisco in the late 1960s, and at least to my eyes, that was definitely a clear influence on Altman's visual look with The Long Goodbye. And it kind of, I think, also maybe showcases as well how Stoner Noir also grew out of the neo-noir movement in general that you started to see in the 60s and 70s. Because previously, I mean, classic noir was always really made heavy use of black and white. That kind of shadowy look with the cigarettes and stuff is what you sort of think of as like the hallmark of classic noir. And then beginning in the 60s, ironically, when color became the sort of the craze, and then every film had to have color in it. The way some of the directors counterbalanced that was really by embracing psychedelica to almost sort of bring in that similar disorientation, I suppose, in the sense that the dark shadows and so forth brought with black and white. So that was an interesting development on that end, and that was probably another thing that was really crucial to the development later of Stoner Noir.
That's interesting. What would be a good example of these 60s films that they're adapting to color where they made it very psychedelia? Like, what are we talking, like Head?
Well, yeah, Head would definitely be one. Let's see. There was also the one that Corman did, I think, that they called The Trip.
The Trip. That's the one I was thinking of as well. Corman. That was a pretty infamous one there, wasn't it? With Nicholson.
Was Nicholson? Yeah. He was in that. He wrote Head too.
Yeah, he wrote Head, yeah.
Let me see. Probably some of the French New Wave as well. Blowout, I would think, would probably be one. Some of those types of movies as well that sort of brought in some of that atmosphere. Vanishing Point, that would be sort of another one I would think of as well. That's a great freaking biker movie, man. Did you guys ever see Vanishing Point?
Vanishing Point? No, I'm not familiar.
Yeah. Seriously, you guys have never seen Vanishing Point? You guys have heard the second Use Your Illusions album, right, by Guns N' Roses?
Sure.
Axl actually quotes the monologue from that DJ in Vanishing Point, like at length in that. They used a sample for that in the Primal Screen movie too. Was it the last American hero to whom speed means freedom of the soul? It's not a question of who's going to stop him, but when he's going to stop, or something like that.
Nice.
Yeah.
So what are we talking? Late 60s? Vanishing Point? Like
Vanishing Point was like 71, I think, if I remember correctly. 71? It was kind of like trying to cash in on like Easy Rider, but I mean, it definitely had more
that's what was
atmosphere to it.
Okay, so it was just kind of a knockoff of Easy Rider's fame, huh?
It was a great knockoff, though.
Pretty standard Hollywood stuff. What's that?
It was a great knockoff, though. I will say that. I mean, it's basically the guy is like trying to drive a car cross country on amphetamines. I mean, it doesn't really have much of a plot, but it's trippy as hell. That's for sure.
Yeah, sounds pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically being like tracked by cops like through the desert, and that's like essentially, yeah, he's like the cops are chasing him all over like the freeways, and then he just takes the car off road, goes like wandering in the desert. He finds like all these Jesus freaks and stuff like that. Definitely, that's a great movie.
Very experimental time of even the Hollywood big budget films, right? They were kind of this was an era where they were taking some chances like that. I feel like.
Thank God for all those drugs getting washed.
Well, it was like it was really big because of how much Easy Rider had revolutionized the industry, because they had made that movie for like practically nothing, and I mean it had made millions and millions of dollars, and that was sort of like the new formula. You were going to have smaller budgets, and in turn filmmakers could do more provocative things with the films. And you could kind of see that with something like A Clockwork Orange, which was a fairly low budget movie by Kubrick standards, but I mean it was something where he could really go to town with all of the nudity and violence he couldn't have done previously.
Yeah, that was the era of exploitation, right, across the board in Hollywood, and
the big exploitation era,
the nudie film era, or side of Hollywood as well.
Porn had also, revolutionized the industry too. I mean, Debbie Does Dallas had made, what was it, $400 million or something like that during the run. That's like the 70s, guys. Like, keep in mind, like, so these just for inflation, I mean, it's staggering the amount of money that made.
Oh yeah, or the mob financed film Deep Throat that premiered at a process theater there in Hollywood. That was a kind of the early onset of these sexploitation films and pornography right there, and that was a huge money maker for the mob for sure.
And cover for drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. But all those details, it seems like the drug trafficking, the cults, the mob, it seems like these are often
they made a lot of good movies. We'll just say that.
Well, yeah, so they're common elements in the Stoner Noir franchise, right? Of films, specifically in films such as The Big Lebowski, right? In my opinion, so like you can look at this film as from the dude, being involved in this whole mystery. You can kind of look at it, the dude trying to replace his rug. I look at it as the dude getting entrapped in this weird sex cult, right? So there's like this weird sex cult.
Yep.
That certainly has entrapped the dude in this weird mystery, right? Because they're trying to. They're trying to do hood rat stuff. They're trying to steal money, right? They're trying to money launder money from the foundation they've spent on Lord knows what else, but it involves a pornography actors and actresses, the millionaire, right? The Big Lebowski, right? He's the millionaire guy in the little sex cult operation. Seems to include elements
for Howard Hughes, even
could be sure. Is that what kind of your take? What are your all's thoughts? That's kind of how I look at the Big Lebowski. Doc, Recluse, what either one of you, what are some of your all's thoughts? I think this is, when I think of Stoner Noir, this is kind of one of this and Inherent Vice are probably like the bullseye, kind of the right on target as far as within that film genre. What are your all's thoughts on the subject?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, like a lot of films in this genre, it deals heavily with the overlap between pornography and Hollywood. And it's interesting because it's a lot of times these are the only types of movies that are able to touch this subject, or maybe, even more conventional exploitation films. We recently did on the Farm horror movie roundtable, and one of the films that was recommended was Cage Fury, which nominally is a women in prison film. I mean, it's supposed to be basically a sexploitation movie, but it really ends up having some very interesting plot developments that get into just the specter that pornography has in Hollywood. And this is, again, I mean, a subject that you see in The Nice Guys and The Big Lebowski, a lot of these other ones. And it just, I mean, it really goes back to the beginning of the industry itself. I mean, this was something recently I had Andrea Nolan on to discuss based on a lot of her excellent research. And there's a lot of just compelling evidence that the early stag film industry, which really originated around the time of World War I, was heavily subsidized by the United States Navy as a means of combating venereal diseases amongst the ranks because, surprise, surprise, sailors like to frolic around with whores when they're on leave. Would have imagined, right? So that
kind of go like peanut butter and jelly, right? Sailors and whores. No, I listened to that podcast. That was a good one. That was a good.
And it's it had become a major issue as a as a health crisis for the military.
Sure.
In terms of readiness, combat readiness, all this other stuff. So this is one of the means.
That's a big deal in the military, combat readiness. That's really it's one of the most deciding factors every day in the military is are we achieving combat readiness? And there's different metrics for it. So yeah,
so this is one of the ways
would be a big deal.
This is one of the ways they were going to help the sailors achieve combat readiness. Instead of having going on leave and frolicking with whores, they were just going to go and jack off with each other to these quote unquote health movies.
Wow.
Mind, they were all health movies, okay? They're not stag movies and our pornography. They're health movies.
Health movies.
So this is essentially where the origins of the health quote unquote film industry came from in Hollywood. And it's always been just essentially closely overlapped with the mainstream industry. And again, there's just so many other developments that went on during this time frame. I mean, you had the closing of a lot of the historic red light districts across the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century. Nobody really talks about where the women who were working there ended up. But again, so many women were also incidentally migrating out to Hollywood in this time frame to try to break into the industry. And well, there were obviously other alternatives if you were not necessarily set up to be the next it girl. So health films might have been one of the things that they were looking at. So
sure,
this is, it's just been a dirty go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh,
well, I mean, it's just
go ahead.
It's been a dirty secret in Hollywood for a lot of years, and it just seems like when you want to try to address it, you have to go about that and the means of a movie like The Big Lebowski,
sure,
which has a lot of very interesting, very pointed references to real life events. In fact, I think the plot line was roughly based on the saga of a rather well known pornographic star. And well, let's just say
who's that?
Pardon me.
What's the well-known pornographic story?
Is that the Tara Reid character that you're referring to?
Oh yeah, that would be the one.
Okay.
I'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's it's definitely, I would say, very much based on this, and I have to think that the Coen brothers were probably privy to some inside information in reference to some of these things.
Well, but sure, because the actual character, the Lebowski character, the dude, right? He's an actual real world guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, yeah, he was based on one of the yippies, and I mean, that's kind of another interesting thing about that is I think in a sense, they're also sort of satirizing some of these different like milieus in Hollywood. I mean, obviously you have sort of the yippie presence there. You have like Walter, who I think would be sort of a stand-in for like
John Millis,
sort of like John Bircher milieu.
Oh, absolutely. Milieu. Walter Sobchak. It's one of my favorite
John
characters.
Milius. Yeah, John
Milius. Yeah, he was definitely an inspiration for Walter.
The guy who wrote Conan and was a producer for Barton Fink.
Oh, okay. So he would have known Goodman, huh? Him and Goodman would have known each other.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, the Juliana
That's a deep cut Goodman film. Barton
Fink.
Fink. I haven't heard that title in a long time. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, he was a longtime collaborator with the Coen brothers. And the Coen brothers definitely know a lot about Hollywood, and they're definitely, this is on display in the Big Lebowski. And I think you guys made a good point about how this kind of highlights a lot of the sex scandals and some of the poor intersection of the porn industry with like Hollywood itself, which at a cursory glance you wouldn't think there was like much going on in those terms, but the more you delve into like Hollywood, the more seedy you find a lot of the origins of Hollywood is.
Yeah.
And I would even add one more thing to like what you said about the dude. I would even say that a lot of the elite probably even select certain people to sacrifice. Let's not say literal sacrifice, but people that are kind of the feast of the fool. So what I think is what is going on also is on top of all this like espionage and the skullduggery, I think also what's going on is that he's kind of the feast of the fool, where they're kind of taking him and you sort of using him as the scapegoat, and you sort of using him as the sacrifice, but not a literal sacrifice, just the fall guy. And they're describing this type of ritual that's going on because.
So you're describing a ritual, right? I mean, that's what I was going to ask. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Film itself, and I think Steven has talked about this in like a lot of his podcasts, and the film in itself and the film industry is very caught up on ritualistic symbolism, and especially the elite and the wealthy. They have these sort of initiatory things that go all the way from warriors to fools to different subsets of people, and there's no way to doubt that filmmaking itself is not only intersected with the seedy underworld of like sexual trafficking, but it's also involved with a lot of the stuff. Because what's interesting is I think what is it?
Let me interject real quick, Doc. That's a great point. That's a great point. When we mentioned earlier, Recluse mentioned the Guns N' Roses album, which was a huge album there in the late '80s, early '90s. Guns N' Roses was, worldwide big sensation. But a lot of those bands were only a big sensation if they got the approval of a musical production magazine, kind of like Rolling Stones, but more for just the rock era. It was owned by Larry Flint, the infamous hustler pornographer that was involved, or at least tertiarily connected to numerous scandals throughout the years, O.J. Simpson stuff, coke dealing, the Cotton Club murders, you name it. But Larry Flint, the hustler guy, started a rock magazine. And apparently, if you didn't get, this guy had a very, the guy who ran it, one of Larry Flint's editors there at his executive editors there at Hustler, he put in charge of the rock magazine Rip. So that's a kind of the intersection of the Hollywood, the pornography, and the music industry right there in Los Angeles with this magazine. But apparently, bands from like Guns N' Roses to Soundgarden, and apparently Nirvana said no. But apparently they had to do weird sexual stuff with the owner.
They had people like magazine. Steve Albini and all those weirdos. But
I didn't want to get into that diddler. But that's a good point. So I think I look at those kind of epicenters of activity. I mean, we look at them as different industries, right? But it's really just kind of one industry, right? Like, and they're all there in Los Angeles. They all cross over with one another in some regard. I mean, when you're talking photography, I mean, of course they're going to be in the film, they're going to be in the pornography industry as well. And so you're talking about a lot of the same people. I think the Lebowski kind of does a good job at capturing that. But I think you point out as well, like that's a great point you point out, is the ritual aspect. I think it is
he's
kind
also
of
a double.
Humiliation kind of
is also a
ritual.
double. He's also a double of somebody else as well. That's a common theme, and he's like a double of somebody else too. He's a double of like the other guy they're trying to
like the Feast of Fools and the Lord of Misrule, where essentially the religious orders, like going up to New Year's, I think it would have been starting on St. Stephen's Day, which I think is December 26th. You would have had this sort of week-long kind of festivities where, I mean, it's almost like a Saturnalia. Essentially,
I was going to say, Saturnalia, right?
Yeah. Saying like the mass instead of the bishop, and just everybody reverses roles and all this other kind of stuff. Sure. And it would end with you appointing like a lower clergy member to be the proverbial pope or something of the order, and that would be the king of fools, if you will. And you have different traditions in this, like in the UK, you have the Lord of Misrule and so forth. So the dude is essentially the fool, the stand-in for like the actual Lebowski, and they're sort of using him, going through this kind of ritual humiliation, bringing him into high society where he's interacting with all of these other people that he would never, otherwise probably encounter. So, yeah, I would definitely say Doc is really spot on with that.
No, I think that's a great point.
Also,
Nick,
highlight
Oh, go ahead, Doc.
Sorry, go ahead. No, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll let Nick comment.
No, I was just going to ask Nick about the ritual aspects. Do you have any input on the ritual aspects? Or you see any other occult aspects of the Lebowski? I know one thing it's long been rumored is that Crowley was involved, and Aleister Crowley, that is, was involved in some capacity in the design of the mansion used in this film, which was owned by the not the Getty family, the Irish oil barons of Los Angeles, whom I can't think of their name right now. Anyway, the home of the Big Lebowski, the wheelchaired Lebowski uses, the Big Lebowski, is actually a old money oil money mansion there. It's now turned into a museum. It's actually a pretty nice spot. But
like the Doheny family.
Oh, there you go. Yep, the Dohenys. Yep, thank you, Stephen. Yep. So that's the old Ned Doheny mansion. That's in the film. I don't know. Do you have any knowledge there, Stephen, as far as any connections to the rumors that Crowley was involved in somehow designing some of that mansion?
No.
Yeah, I've never really found much validity to it, but it's long rumored.
I've never seen anything like that. Richard Spence had never pointed out anything like that as well, and he really, from what I recall, I mean, he's done a lot with Crowley and a lot of those intersections as well with Secret Agent 666. But the Doheny family is interesting, though, and I think that might have been what the reference was, because they were really tied into the Teapot Dome scandal. Which is really overlooked now, but that was arguably the biggest political scandal in the United States prior to the Cold War. Well, really, if William Harding had not died in office, it probably would have brought down his administration, but it implemented a lot of people within the administration. And it was really big for Hollywood as well, because the close ties they had ended up with Harding. They had brought I can't remember his first name, Hayes, the guy who came up with the Hayes codes, essentially the precursor to the MPAA, but they had brought him in from Harding's administration. He had actually been the Postmaster General, if I recall correctly, which is interesting because Postmaster General had a lot of mojo back then, because he could essentially decide what would be sent in the mail. So if something was decided to be obscene or pornographic, he could censor it. So this was how like the Comstock laws had historically been enforced, was through the Postmaster General. And this is why they thought Hayes would be a great guy to regulate Hollywood. So there was a lot of intersection with the Harding administration, and again, the close ties the Dohenys had to Hollywood. There was a lot of speculation that this might have played into some of the other scandals that were playing out during this time, because this is also sort of going around, right after the time of the water wars and stuff like that, where Theodore Roosevelt had essentially intervened to relocate a lot of the water into the LA area. This was basically the plot line for Chinatown, if you will. So yeah, there was a lot of just political mechanisms going on right there. And the Teapot Dome scandal was really indicative of the rising influence that Hollywood had. It was one of the first major political scandals where Hollywood was involved in a national level. And I just think that might have been another reason why the Coen brothers would have wanted to use that location.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve, and I appreciate that. Yeah, and now that you mentioned those aspects, it kind of reminds me of the character in the Paul Thomas Anderson film There Will Be Blood, which is, I believe, based on Doheny, referencing that same kind of oil. I don't think specifically the Teapot Dome, but definitely that same era of the oil boom.
If I'm not mistaken, I think there was some kind of bizarre murder involving the location as well, but I'm not entirely sure about that, though.
Well, that would seem to go in character with the area of Hollywood and Los Angeles in general. So it would be interesting. I'm gonna have to look into that. So, Nick, did you have any commentary on the some of the ritual aspects of the Lebowski being the fool, or maybe some of the occult aspects you've seen or are aware of in the Big Lebowski?
Yeah. First, if just my opinion, if Crowley had anything to do with designing it,
potato.
I would say, yeah. Well, some people go, oh my god,
Some people get nuts, huh?
Yeah. Oh, I think he even pointed it out in like his book 1 or 2 times too, to correct people on how his name was said. He specified Crow, like Crow.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. I apologize.
No, go ahead. If he did design it at all or had anything to do with it, I would just like look in. If people are wondering, maybe see if you can look to see how the ritual for the Abramelin would be done. There's certain specifics for like kind of where you are if you're staying at. The specifics that the house should be facing certain ways. I don't remember that specifically off the top of my head anymore, what the specifics were exactly, but maybe that's what was done. That's the only thing I could really see, like maybe being bothered with. That might be interesting to see if maybe the house is done in a certain way that would fit the Abramelin. Then I would wonder if that was done on purpose. With that movie, just like Doc was saying before, how there was like kind of like a double of him. I can, and this would be a reason why I think you could start getting into sexual stuff just because of possibly physiology going on in the magician's body, especially in their eyes. I could see maybe seeing the hero's journey and possibly throwing sexual stuff in there to be showing that. Even though they're not still the same person and there's a separation of them, that is kind of like the hero's journey is like, it's hard to explain, but I do think
I can see the hero's journey in the story of the dude for sure. I mean,
and then like even touching on this, there is times in here where I do think it gets a little psychedelic, and
oh yeah,
with the hallucinations or the dreams. Yes. What are we talking about here?
I think when he gets knocked out, doesn't he kind of seem like he's like somewhere?
Yeah,
he blasts off literally.
Lebowski, the scene with Maud Lebowski, I was going to highlight and talked about the kind of sex scene that's in that. It's inferred that she's like stealing his semen or whatever, and like she doesn't want any contact with him. And matter of fact, she kind of insults him at first and said, "Are you the cable guy?" But it's clear that it's kind of interesting. So this guy's supposed to be a stand-in for the Lebowski, family, and Maud Lebowski is related. That's kind of strange, but I mean, elite people and rich people are into that kind of stuff. So
you talking about the implications of incest?
Yes.
Nice.
I had to put it out.
No, that's a great point, and it is. It is seemed to be an elite thing. That's part of the storyline in Chinatown, as we mentioned before. That's
and not only that, but it's like also. I mean, that would also be part of a noir kind of trope.
Sure,
that's in there, but also, I think the kind of sexual act that she's engaging in, and what's interesting is she's kind of an artist or whatever. All these like rich heirs, they all have connections to, art school and all those kind of intelligence apparatchik. That's kind of interesting too, but. I think there's really kind of a ritualistic connection to Maud Lebowski and like the double and Lebowski himself. That I think needs to probably be explored more when we talk about this film. But I just wanted to interject that really quick.
No, that's a great point.
I thought that was kind of strange in the film. It always struck me as strange.
Well, that's a good point. A lot of ins, a lot of outs, a couple what have yous.
And yes, there was a bizarre death at the Greystone Mansion, which is the name used in there. To quote from Wikipedia, on February 16th, 1929, 4 months after Ed Doheny, his wife Lucy, and their 5 children moved into Greystone, Doheny died in a guest bedroom in a murder-suicide with his secretary, Hugh Plunkett. The official story indicated that Plunkett murdered Doheny either because of a, quote, nervous disorder or because he was angry over not receiving a raise. Others point out that Doheny's gun was the murder weapon and that Doheny was not buried in Los Angeles Calvary Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery, with the rest of the family, indicating he had committed suicide. Both men are buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, Glendale, within a few hundred yards of each other. Both were involved in the trial of Doheny's father and the Teapot Dome scandal.
Oh, okay. So that was the Dohenys were directly involved in Teapot Dome there, huh?
Yep. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting history with that house, no doubt, with all of that.
Sure, yeah, and it is a centerpiece of the film. I mean, that is the home of the Big Lebowski, and seemingly where they plotted out a lot of the activities they're perpetrating on the dude, with a brilliant performance by Philip Seymour Hoffman as the Lebowski's assistant. I thought he killed it. I like him in a lot of roles.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that, Recluse. That's a great point, man. That's and I think on the topic of the Doheny clan, I believe Ed Doheny, he was the patriarch. His grandson Ned Doheny, with an N, I believe, was murdered in the 1960s. He was part of the Laurel Canyon rock scene, a rocker in one of the bands.
Yeah. No, the Dohenys definitely have a really interesting family history.
And speaking of Ned Doheny serving as the character basis, Ed Doheny serving as the character basis of and There Will Be Blood, the Paul Thomas Anderson film. This is probably, which is one of my, I'm a big fan of that film as well, but not so much as this Paul Thomas Anderson film based upon the Thomas Pynchon novel, Inherent Vice, which I feel like connected to on a molecular level, being that this is largely about a private detective who likes to smoke pot, and I connect with those characteristics pretty deeply in life. I like this movie poster I used here though with Josh Brolin, because I like to joke that this is really a story about Josh Brolin and not about Joaquin Phoenix's character. But yeah, Go ahead, Doc.
Well, you
what
know
do you
what?
got?
You know what Pynchon said. You know what Pynchon said. He said weirdos share the same wavelength as him. So he said
Nice.
all weirdos share the same wavelength as Pynchon. I just wanted to
I like it.
interject that.
No, I like it. I you know a lot. I enjoy your character details about Pynchon. I've only started getting into his work recently because this is the first one I've read of his books. But this is a Stoner Noir film. I think at its heart. Am I right there, Recluse?
Yeah, this is generally considered to be like one of the holy trinity of Stoner Noir pictures, along with
Sure.
Big Lebowski and Under the Silver Lake. So yeah, I would say Inherent Vice is pretty quintessential as far as it goes.
What do you what is the story? How do you view this story? Because like I said, I could kind of view it like this movie poster shows it the story about Josh Brolin, because we dove into this pretty deep on a farm podcast, I believe, last year, if I'm correct there, Stephen. But so if any folks of the interwebs want to get in a much greater detail on some of the parapolitical things there than the topical discussion we're going to have on it tonight, I highly implore you to check that out and to check out the other farm podcast episode with Dr. Inferno discussing these specific details as well of Stoner Noir. But I could really view Inherent Vice being a story of an LAPD robbery homicide detective, Lieutenant Bigfoot Bjornson here, played by Josh Brolin, is he's kind of serving as he's perpetrating this whole much like the Lebowski was being perpetrated as a fool by these powerful, seemingly a cult of people there in Los Angeles. In this storyline, it seems like Brolin's kind of the puppet master here, kind of playing the strings of Jacqueline Phoenix's character. It's kind of a spoiler alert as far as that perspective of the film goes, but I certainly think that's or the story here. I certainly think that's one way it could be looked at.
Do you kind of see him as the handler of the of Doc's Bolero?
I see him. Yeah, I see him doing everything. I see folks to the interwebs. Kind of a spoiler alert here. If you haven't seen this, I highly recommend this film. But yeah, I see him. He's upset with the deep state elements of Los Angeles. He's aware of it. He has no ethical problems participating in a lot of these activities, except he drew the line at them murdering his partner. So as a result of them murdering his partner, he wanted to get back at the gangster who murdered his partner, and happened to do that by orchestrating some of the police informants, the Owen Wilson character, by orchestrating activities surrounding Shasta Faye Hepworth, Jacqueline Phoenix's girlfriend, his character's girlfriend in the film, his love interest. She's playing this part as well, this kind of CIA Project Chaos kind of FBI COINTELPRO world. She's deeply involved in that, and so is he, obviously, as an LAPD robbery homicide fellow detective lieutenant there in the bureau. So he the detective bureau. So I think that's kind of the way I look at it. What do you guys view it as? What are your all's thoughts?
I view you're talking about Bigfoot Bjornson. I view his character as kind of
the storyline. Just how do you feel about the storyline? Like, obviously, Jacqueline Phoenix is the main character as portrayed in the film, but I could make an argument, like I said, as Josh Brolin being kind of the main character and puppet master of things. But like, how do you all view it there, Doc and Recluse?
That seems like a good argument. I would say like the way Pynchon does a lot of it, and I'm kind of biased here because I'm familiar with like Pynchon's style, and that kind of makes me a little biased. What I think is like Pynchon's talking about a little commentary on police corruption,
Sure.
drug trafficking coming in from like the Golden Triangle, kind of a residual left over from Vietnam, and also like Pynchon's sort of stumbling upon this entire police corruption scandal, which I think is known as the Ramparts, which is still even involved today, goes deep into LA history. So Pynchon, I think, actually accidentally stumbled upon this probably when he was spending time in LA talking to some of the common people that he liked to do. But I think the way that Pynchon designed this is that he wanted to make clearly a noir story. And anything with Pynchon is never as simple, but it's simple at the same time, meaning that there's a sprawling kind of characterization of all these different characters that interact with one another, but still there's like it doesn't seem like the story really materializes to anything, and that's kind of an error to a lot of people that look at this story and look at Pynchon. He likes having these sprawling characters and these overarching type of themes, which he'll interject the occult, he'll interject police corruption, he'll interject stuff about the deep state, he'll interject stuff about parapolitics, 60s kind of hippie culture. So that's kind of how I view Inherent Vice. Doc Spolero is not necessarily the main character, but he's probably I would say, the representative of Pynchon in the story. I like your take on Bjornson. I think he's a guy that has a good heart and is stuck in police corruption, and he's stuck in the middle to where he has his principles, but he also has an unorthodox way of his principles. But he's a principled man, but he's stuck in all this corruption, and he doesn't know quite what to do because he's been ousted from the police. But at the same time, he maintains
and
some
Hollywood, right?
Yeah,
and he's ousted from the police and because he's trying to be an actor
in Hollywood
right?
too. Yeah, because he's want to be an actor, so he's an outsider. He's an outsider, just like Doc, and this is why I think Doc and and Bigfoot kind of form this kind of weird bond. Even though they're both antagonists, they're kind of frenemies. They kind of like each other to a certain extent, and he respects Doc's freedom and his free will to be a stoner and a hippie, and Doc kind of respects him too because he's a principled cop, which is quite rare probably in LA at the time. So they got to have this mutual respect, and so their relationship kind of feeds on one another. That's one of the things I saw. But you're right, there are overarching elements like you mentioned about.
I think that's a great point between the two characters. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You stepped on you there, Doc. What were you saying?
No. I finished what I said. Oh. I said it's just overarching kind of themes that dovetail one another. And I think you're correct to note that.
Well, I think the scene that encapsulates the statements you just made as far as the interaction between the Brolin and the Phoenix character, I think that kind of comes, the mutual respect kind of comes to a hilt in the Asian pancake scene. Scene.
Yeah. Where he said there's no book deal for Bigfoot. No book deal.
Yeah. Yeah, but then he's sharing the tip with Phoenix's character, and Phoenix is kind of showing some respect to him at the same time, and he leaves him with a lesson in chemistry, the chemical analysis he was discussing relative to the golden fang, and Brolin's like, oh, you really think you're a cop now, don't you? You really think you got one, don't you? But you can see that mutual respect at that point, I think. Stephen, what were some of your thoughts here on the Inherent Vice, or what Pynchon or Anderson, for that matter, we're trying to capture here in the story?
Well, I mean, I can't really add much to what you guys have already said. I mean, it's obvious, I think, that Pynchon was trying to take what would have been considered maybe more quote unquote lowbrow culture, things like The Long Goodbye and the Big Lebowski and the some of the early Shane Black movies, and essentially tried to turn them into literature while also bringing in some pretty subversive plot points. And kind of doubling what Doc said, I mean, I really think that a lot of this has to have been based on Pynchon's experiences in LA during the 1970s, interacting with a lot of heads and people like that, and probably realizing the extent to which people had been turned into informants. Because, I mean, really, if you step back and look at Inherent Vice, I mean, I think arguably almost everybody in the film is an informant or an asset of some kind or other. And I think you're spot on with Doc Spalding being essentially being run by Bigfoot. But I think it's also interesting, though, because it gets into the turf wars that these different agencies have with assets and informants as well. And I mean, I think clearly you see a rivalry between the LAPD and the FBI, which is of itself a stand-in for the LDS in the film, which again is pretty accurate.
Yes.
And again, this it's fascinating again in the time frame that this is happening as well, the 1970s. I mean, the story is that obviously Los Angeles didn't really have organized crime throughout most of the post-war eras. And, you know, I mean, obviously we can quibble to that, but to some extent it's true in the sense that rather than really having a full-blown mafia in LA, you just had the LAPD itself, which more or less
Right.
served the purpose of being organized crime there.
Sure.
And this is sort of unfolding in an era where the Mormon Mafia was making a big play with Howard Hughes. I think this is something that Pynchon actually hints at more in the novel. They don't really get into it in the film so much. But this also sort of gets into the stuff which Doc and I had talked about with the nice guys. You know, at the time frame, the mob was also theoretically getting into pornography, but also at the time, the Mormons are getting into Las Vegas. So you can almost wonder if part of what is being shown in Inherent Vice was a fictionalized depiction of the sort of turf war that was playing out between these different groups, with the LAPD and a lot of their backers on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the Mormon Church working through the FBI. So that's an interesting dynamic, and specifically how a lot of these groups are using the informants on the ground to try to carry out their agendas.
Sure, I think that's a great analysis there, Stephen. And I think to add to that, just to piggyback on that, I think Doc Sportello can even serve as a Project Chaos type character for the CIA in that same stew of intel operations you just described.
And when we had talked about that before, but I mean on the farm, but I mean definitely not with the novel, but I do think an argument could be made for the film version that Paul Thomas Anderson has left. It opened the possibility that Bigfoot and Doc Spalding might actually be the same person. So I've even gone so far to suggest that Bigfoot might actually be an MK Ultra, quote unquote, programmed assassin or something like that. And Doc Spalding is a sort of alter ego or something that he goes into when he's working as when he's working undercover.
I can see that.
Especially how they end the film with the two characters kind of
where they're talking in unison and what have you. Like, I definitely think Anderson wanted to hint at that.
No, I like that.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, I just think with Anderson including Doc Sportello working out of a free clinic, it's very, Haight-Ashbury free clinic.
Haight-Ashbury, yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a nod to that, I think. But Nick, what are your thoughts? Do you have you seen this one, The Inherent Vice?
Not at all. Nope.
No. Well, all right. Well,
I've heard about it.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. Yeah, for sure. One aspect of the occult I think that's involved in this storyline is, and Doc, Recluse, please feel free to jump in regarding the Manson family. I feel like some of it's overtly mentioned throughout the story. There's a lot of implications that there's this this larger scale kind of drug trafficking cult. The storyline set during the Manson trial or immediately thereafter. So I believe 71, 72. They're not really specific, but the Manson stuff's already occurred because the LAPD's not happy about it in the storyline, and they make reference to it, numerous times. So, yeah. So, I mean, Nick, if you're not familiar with that, I think that's a big occult aspect. But yeah, go ahead.
What's interesting also is that in the novel too, they talk about like Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta is supposed to be this entry point into the Hollow Earth, which figured prominently in like theosophical works and
sure, it's a big time New Age kind of capital, like epicenter,
and it's still like active too. So
big time.
It's kind of interesting how Pynchon interjects a lot of these things into his novels with the Arcana and the Tarot and like Gravity's Rainbow. So he's very much steeped into the occult, and this, to a lesser extent, this book he talks about Lemuria even. And just to make kind of a note a little bit about the aesthetics of the film is that Pynchon, and I don't know if Paul Thomas Anderson was tapping into this, but Pynchon wanted to give the impression that Doc Sportello was kind of in a haze, and as he wrote the book, Doc Sportello gets more and more into the haze to where, like, at the ending of the novel, he's kind of in a mist and a fog. And this is supposed to also symbolize the uncertainty of the future of the 70s and kind of the paranoia you were talking about of the Manson family at the same time, that we were like heading out of like the 60s where we're going into more of a tumultuous type of territory. And so he wanted to symbolize that kind of a haze that was over Doc Sportello and also like a lot of the characters in the book. I just wanted to interject that as part of the aesthetics and part of the like Stoner Noir type
that's
of
a good
things
point.
interjected with Thomas Pynchon often did, and I think Thomas Pynchon was a big fan of like marijuana himself, so I think he really enjoyed it as well. So that's why
aren't we all? Aren't we all? Well,
that's why
I think that's a good point, Doc, because I think Paul Thomas Anderson kind of added to that paranoia aspect in the film version because he makes the narrator and Joaquin Phoenix's friend the same character. So at times you don't know when you're seeing that girl or hearing her talk, you don't know that she's a real character that he's interacting with.
Sortilege. You're talking about Sortilege. Yes, you're right. Sortilege is kind of like a, in my opinion, I think Pynchon was tapping into kind of old European traditions, like what is it, the oracles of Delphi and some of the stuff like the Norns amongst the Norse.
The Knights of Pythias,
like,
huh? Aren't they?
Yeah,
Aren't they the folks that protected the Delphi Oracle?
Kind of like kind of like that. Well, like I said, females were kind of seen as sort of like an oracle in old Europe, and I think that's where he was tapping into, because sortilege means sorceress. If you look into the language, so like she's kind of a forecaster and also a narrator at the same time in the story. Nice. So there's definitely an occultic aspect if you're looking for
I think
inherent
so. Yeah.
place. So
that's a great point. I think so for sure.
A lot of people have speculated if Pynchon himself may have dabbled into the occultic arts, and I think there's some argument. You can make some argumentation that he potentially did from reading a lot of his novels.
Nice.
So anyway, I just want to interject that.
No, I appreciate that. That's good analysis. So let's, Steven, you mentioned the MK Ultra kind of assassin-like aspects of Bigfoot Bjornson's character there, Inherent Vice, the Josh Brolin character. That's kind of the heart as we're getting into the Stoner Noir genre here, further into the Shane Black zone, if you will, of the genre, which he comprises a lot of films in the Stoner Noir genre, including this one right here. The Long Kiss Goodnight was one he wrote involving an MK Ultra like assassin. What are some of your thoughts here relative? Because again, this is not a marijuana focused, marijuana induced mystery being solved by this protagonist here, but Samuel L. Jackson loves his booze and loves smoking some cigarettes here, doesn't he?
Well, Samuel Jackson is definitely, a kind of quintessential Stoner Noir detective, even if he's not an actual stoner. But certainly like buffoonish throughout the film. It's kind of like a running gag that he essentially keeps getting his ass kicked. In fact, I think that's like, what is it? The last part of the film when he kind of saves everybody, like jumps out and it's like, "That's right, motherfuckers, y'all can't kill me." But yeah, it's kind of funny how like Shane Black really inverts the sort of classic private detectives format with this, where typically, you would have the femme fatale with the lost past and the, heroic private detective would help her uncover it. And it starts off a bit like that, but then you start figuring out that the femme fatale is actually this really hardcore assassin, and the private eye is barely able to keep his shit together. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics with that. Gina Davis is just fantastic in this as well. Really.
For sure.
Samuel Jackson is one of the best things about this. But there's just so much.
This is really when he was kind of stepping, if I may interject there, Steve, this is really when he's stepping in to the classic kind of Samuel L. Jackson, character, right? Like when he's really like erupting that character.
Yeah, because this is only a few years removed from Pulp Fiction. This was like, what, 96, 97 or something like that. So Pulp Fiction's only like about 2-3 years like in the rearview mirror, and I think this was like one of the first fairly successful movies he did after that as well, where he was one of the sort of headliners with it.
No, he was great. Yeah, I really like the aspect of the storyline, as you said. She's got amnesia. She's lost. That she's forgotten. She's this this MK Ultra mind controlled assassin. She's a school teacher now, but then this mobster, she's in the news, and this mobster sees her that she, was supposed to kill, but apparently failed, and that was her last mission when she got injured and lost her memory. But yeah, I think that's an interesting storyline they wrote. Incorporates the CIA, black elements even of that, as far as off the books projects, if you will, organized crime. So yeah, that's some interesting
a little
details.
Bit of predictive programming too was in this movie.
Oh.
Yeah, they kind of like forecasted 9/11, or at least bombings that would kind of happen in later times.
Well, I really don't know that this would be the case of predictive programming per se, because this is also coming out like roughly around the same time as Oklahoma City bombing, where there was a lot of speculation that there might have been an Islamic presence in it as well, possibly to try to raise up possible specter of a war with Iraq, incidentally, which was a popular narrative back then. So
the 94 World Trade Center bombing. So yeah, I mean, there was
I've gotten the impression, the very distinct impression, that Shane Black really enjoyed reading Usenet back in the 90s, because you can see a lot of conspiracy stuff in his movies. I think in this case, this was probably just more a case of Shane Black doing his homework and making a pretty accurate projection of how the security services would potentially stage a false flag and who they would potentially blame.
Sure. Okay. That's a good analysis.
You think Shane Black was a Usenet appreciator?
Yeah, let's just say
he does incorporate some early tropes here, right? Conspiracy culture tropes that weren't really present at that time.
That's interesting.
Outside of things like Usenet.
Appreciator.
Well, I mean, you can definitely, because I mean, kind of going back with like The Last Boy Scout, I mean, obviously he had done a lot of research on the scandals unfolding with the NFL at the time. I mean, I think with like The Long Goodbye The Long Kiss Goodnight, you can start to see a lot of the sort of popular conspiracy tropes, because again, a lot of the stuff with like the Iraqi connection to Oklahoma City was really, really big back in this whole time frame with J. Orland Gravy and a lot of these kind of people discussing this aspect of it. Later on, I mean, with some of the, again, with the Nice Guys, the references to sort of the connections to porn in LA and the film industry, and that also possibly the Mormon Mafia as well, and Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. I mean, you could look at with the Val Kilmer character, possibly some references to Thomas Corbally and the interactions that he had in Hollywood. So I get the sense that Black was just a guy who really looked to some unconventional sources for storylines.
I think that's a solid point. Yeah, because I remember those Usenet forums of the 90s as far as conspiracy culture goes. And these ideas were really, there was limited areas back then you could really find these ideas. I mean, there's a few books, I'm thinking of like maybe The Secret and suppressed volumes they produced there in the 90s. But it's very limited sources. So yeah, that's a good analysis. He's clearly getting these ideas from somewhere, and characters like J. Orland Gravy is an often forgot character, but he was big into the conspiracy culture of the 90s, including, I believe, surrounding the Clintons, if I'm not mistaken.
He was a big guy with like the Whitewater stuff as well, and Vince Foster, and also the Promise stuff.
Yeah, Vince Foster, yeah. Nick, have you seen The Long Kiss Goodnight?
Nope, I haven't seen that either.
Oh man, I highly recommend this one, especially with the mind control assassin stuff and some classic Samuel L. Jackson comedy. I mean, it's a good one. It is a good one. But Stephen, you mentioned a couple other Shane Black films there. The Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. What were you were saying that you saw some Thomas Corbally aspects in this one, huh? I think that's an interesting analysis of this storyline. What are your all's thoughts here, Doctor and Recluse? What are your all's thoughts here on this film?
One thing I like about this film, I'm gonna say, is it kind of also like dumps like all of the tropes of like even the neo-noir, kind of films on its head. First of all, the Val Kilmer character, I believe, is a gay man. He's not a straight figure, which is
kind of. Do they really clarify that? They kind of play the fence on that, right?
Well,
they call him Gay Perry, but
it's kind of like agreed that he's probably like a little fruity.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you.
Which is kind of unusual for like a lot of. It might not be that unusual, but usually kind of the private dick character, although he might not be the most masculine figure, he's kind of also seen as like definitely not a gay.
Yeah, he's usually like an alpha male. I mean, there's sort of like the famous scene in what was it, The Maltese Falcon, I think, where like Humphrey Bogart finds the perfumed handkerchief in Peter Lorre's jacket vest, and he just starts slapping him around, and it's kind of like, well, back in the day that was a sign that he was gay because he had the perfume handkerchief, and because bogey's bogey, I mean, he's got to slap him, so Like, yeah, I think it's definitely sort of like very much like kind of mocking that sort of mindset that you see in the classic private detective films with the gay Perry character.
Sure.
Another thing that's interesting about this film is
let me interject real quick, Doc. Kilmer killed this. I mean, this was his return to the big screen. Him and Downey both. Yeah. This was kind of redeeming their careers.
Well, I think he did good in The Salton Sea too. I think he was pretty good in that one too. It's underrated. Replaced like the saxophonist, methamphetamine addict.
Sure.
He did really good in that one. Which I think precedes this one.
What were your thoughts on Kiss Kiss Bang Bang?
One thing that's very interesting about this is I find this like intriguing that the Robert Downey Jr. character, I believe, is kind of a cat burglar. So the technique that he employs is that I think he stumbles upon like some secrets or whatever, probably some Hollywood secrets or whatever, and he decides to become like an actor, and so he entrenches himself in the whole Hollywood scene. And I thought this was like one of the more intriguing aspects of this film is that it's kind of like a guy that is kind of an outsider, a burglar. He breaks into like somebody's house, he stumbles upon this. And I know this is like an old trope. I understand. This has kind of like been done to death with like neo-noir films, but he sees like a death. He stumbles in that, and then he goes and he decides that he's going to break into the world of Hollywood through being an actor. So I find that whole like the actor as like the private detective, the actor as like the spy aspect to be an interesting aspect of this film and overlooked.
Okay. That's interesting. And to speak to the bumbling nature of Downey Jr.'s character, he kind of accidentally becomes an actor in Hollywood,
that's what
right?
I mean. That's what I mean. Yeah, he goes out there and tries out, and they like him. And
he's running away from the cops, though, right? Like he's hiding out from the cops.
He's
running away from a burglary, right? His friend just got shot.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, what were some of your thoughts relative to the Stoner Noir, especially I'm interested more in hear more about this Thomas Corbally angle. He's obviously a powerful parapolitical figure.
Yeah, Corbally was, for those of you unaware, he was the longtime private detective used by Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's political mentor and attorney. Corbally turns up in a lot of really infamous sex scandals over multiple decades. Probably the big one was Perfumo, which brought down the Macmillan government in the UK in 1963, and potentially would have also implicated Kennedy as well. Kennedy was assassinated before a lot of that played out, however, and there's actually been some pretty compelling arguments made that Perfumo might have been one of the more overlooked aspects behind the assassination. But Corbally had ended up in the UK after the initial scandal had really unfolded. And for those of you unaware, it involved a woman, Christine Keeler, who had an affair with John Perfumo, who was a part of Macmillan's cabinet, and the Soviet naval attaché, who was also an agent for the GRU, the Soviet military intelligence. So this was very compromising for Perfumo. It was disastrous for Macmillan. The sort of quasi-pimp for Keeler was a society osteopath named Stephen Ward. Ward also had other girls that he ran, and potentially some of them had also linked up with JFK in New York shortly after Kennedy had won the presidency in 1960, but before he was inaugurated. So anyway, there's speculation that this is why Corbally had ended up in the UK in the early 60s. He was trying to suss out the legitimacy of these claims, whether or not they were something that the security services should be concerned about. At the time, his roommate was a guy called William Mellon Hitchcock, who would go on to become the financier for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love after he left the UK. So he and Corbally were throwing orgies out of this flat that they had in the UK. They had befriended Ward. They were getting all the dirt on this. Then Corbally had headed back to the United States. He made a beeline for Roy Cohn, told him all the stuff that he had sussed out from Ward. And as far as I know, the statements that Cohn gave to the FBI on behalf of Corbally are still classified. So that's interesting. Later, Corbally turned up in the Monica Heller thing involving Roy Radin and Long Island around 1980. He was sort of the godfather for that S&M scene out there. And then towards the end of his life, he was a big figure in the Heidi Fleiss scandal. Heidi Fleiss was one of Hollywood's more infamous madams. This broke out around the late 1980s, early 1990s. Corbally was reportedly the guy who had paid Fleiss's attorney fees with the stipulation that she had to, she could not reveal the name of her clients effectively for the money that he gave her. Sure. But Corbally had been a figure in Hollywood for years, going back to at least the early 1960s. He had dated several actresses. One of them was... I can't remember her name, but she had been Elvis Presley's co-star in Blue Hawaii, and she had indicated at one point
that big time Hollywood A-list actresses he was dating.
Yeah, he had movie star looks as well. He was definitely quite a handsome man in his prime, so that's not totally surprising. And again, he was a private detective. He had worked with military intelligence during World War II. He had a lot of ties to organized crime as well. So I mean, he was very much an international man of mystery.
Yeah, working both continents. It sounds like over there in Europe and America here, kind of simultaneously at times.
But you just, Corbally, I mean, I feel like Kilmore is sort of, to some extent, his character in this is meant to hint at Corbally. He's this very attractive, this debonair man who is intersecting in these Hollywood circles. And nobody really totally knows why he's there. I mean, theoretically, he's supposed to be advising Robert Downey Jr. in his role, but it's sort of later revealed that that's a whole ruse, and they're just basically using him to try to drive down the other actor's salary or something like that. So it's kind of like that thing. I mean, it's, essentially this is the gist I got of how Corbally just interacted in Hollywood. Just for years and years, you would go to these, these big A-list parties where there was lots of drugs and women, and there would just be this debonair, man sort of lingering in the background amongst the smoke. He had these movie star looks, but he wasn't involved in the industry per se. He was supposedly this private detective, and he always seemed to know how to procure girls for people nonetheless. And it just sort of makes me think that this was maybe a bit of what Black was hinting at with the Gay Paris character, how there are these sort of fixer characters that linger on the shadows of Hollywood, that sort of carry out a lot of these activities, these more shadowy activities for the studios on the side.
I think that's a solid analysis of the character there Kilmer has. He definitely does play this kind of, as you pointed out, a debonair kind of PI that, despite like he's not clearly like working along with the antagonist, but like he's never surprised at the scumbaggery and shenanigans being portrayed in the mystery they're involved in there. As far as the Hollywood producer, the double, the fake, the daughter he kills, and then the fake daughter, and his character's never really a surprise, almost as if he's accustomed to doing all of these kind of bagman details, for other folks, right? Like that's kind of how I perceived it, his response to those activities.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, probably a lot of studios have, a private detective like this on retainer as well. I mean, Corbally was probably the most well-known, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is, probably a real-life fixture, a real-life figure that Black had encountered a time or two in Hollywood.
Sure. Makes sense to me. Nick, have you seen the Kiss Kiss Bang Bang? No. Strike 3 on this one too, huh? Dude, I highly recommend it.
Movies.
So the big
what's that?
Gotta watch more Shane Black movies, man.
Oh yeah. We've already got a couple folks in the chat, I think, turned on to some of these films here. As far as they're going to go watch these things, I highly recommend this one as well. There, Nick. It's as we've already mentioned here, it's got some great elements to it. As far as the what I appreciate about this film, and what I often appreciate about a lot of Shane Black's films, is obviously the buddy cop kind of duo that goes on in these films. There's always this buddy cop. He wrote the first 2 Lethal Weapons. This kind of action buddy cop. I like the way the doc puts it as far as the cerebral action, because it incorporates all these, as we've already discussed, these parapolitical things like Recluse was just mentioning with the Thomas Corbally stuff. Corbally is an interesting character, as Stephen pointed out there. But this one's
I mean, with Black, it's just, I mean, you know, I definitely got to like emphasize what Doc had said with him. I mean, on the one hand, he's able to just craft, you know, films that work. I mean, as these conventional, almost John Woo type action films. But conversely, I mean, the dialogue, the interaction between the characters, I mean, this is as good as anything Tarantino's written. I mean, as clever as anything that he's written. And then on top of that, I mean, you do have a lot of depth to his storylines if you know certain histories. There's a lot to take away from his movies, so you never feel like he's insulting your intelligence when you're watching these movies, even if you are pretty smart.
That's a solid point. And yeah, as far as the comparison to Tarantino, Shane Black can do a nonlinear storyline just as well as Tarantino, in my opinion. I mean, no, that's one of the popular aspects of Pulp Fiction, but Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, it's got a lot of nonlinear aspects to it.
And I would say, unlike Tarantino, he actually draws from his source material in a non-patronizing way. Tarantino can't. I mean, I think we kind of talked about this in the Stoner Noir episode, but Tarantino really can't seem to draw upon his own. It's either his own experiences, or it's like from previous obscure films, everything from exploitation to Goddard. Sure. Can't really like seem to make an original film that's not a pastiche. That's my opinion of Tarantino.
That's fair. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm not a big Tarantino fan myself.
I don't have a high. I do love Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, but as far as they are what they are, you know,
once upon a time in Hollywood, I can appreciate some aspects of that film.
What's kind of like, I mean, it's like, I feel like Tarantino, I mean, like you're saying, Doc, he's basically just trying to recreate like other films. Whereas with Black, I feel like he's actually trying to bring a lot of these obscure storylines that he was reading about in Usenet, probably now that he's finding like on blogs, podcasts and stuff, and trying to find clever ways to fictionalize this stuff. And I think that's sort of where, I mean, to me at least, it resonates with just a general much more creativity and originality in Black's pictures.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely got a deeper narrative to it, for sure. Yeah. Well, I think possibly my favorite Shane Black film is the, what was this, 2017, 2018, The Nice Guys?
I think this is mine too.
Yeah.
Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling. You guys share the same sentiments. It's one of your all's favorite Shane Black film.
You know, I never seen this. I kind of like hand waved this film off. Until,
I had to twist his arm to watch this one, actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I was like this. I was just saying that I thought, you know, like Ryan Gosling has the reputation of being a pretty boy, and usually he's in these like literally me movies that are common like on the internet. Notebook. You know, he's like in these literally me movies, and this one kind of surprised me that he is a good comedic actor.
Oh, you know, I thought he killed it in this film. Both of them. Yeah, both of them.
Yeah, he should. And to see him kind of like in a Weasley kind of cowardly role, instead of like being like the badass in Drive or like some of his other films where they try to cast him as
they kind of updated like the Bruce Willis character from The Last Boy Scout with his character in this, but only made him like even more pathetic. Because I mean, Bruce only had to be bailed out, I think, like once by his daughter in The Last Boy Scout, but Gosling, this whole movie, his daughter's got to bail him out.
His daughter practically.
That's a good comparison.
In this movie, his daughter practically solves the
scene. Like I think at the beginning of like Last Boy Scout, where Bruce Willis, like after he's gotten up from like the drunk from the night before, he looks at himself like in his rear view mirror, and he's like, "Smile, you fuck, nobody likes you," or something like that. And then I think in like Nice Guys, like Ryan Reynolds even has like that tattooed like on his his hand or something like that. You're a loser.
Yeah,
and nobody likes you or something like that.
Your life is you know, your life is miserable. I think it says that. Like your life is nothing is good in your life. I think that's what it says.
He definitely plays the bumbling detective drunk. Like, I mean, he's great. I mean, he nails that character throughout the whole film. He's constantly inebriated, constantly stumbling into solving elements of the mystery. Like when he falls off the balcony and then tumbles down the hill and finds the missing porn king they're looking for.
And he always seems to have dumb luck too. That's the only thing about Shane Black's characters is they always in the nick of time. It's always they're in dangerous situations. I think one of the scenes is where like he dives off like the skyscraper and he ends up in the pool.
Sure.
It's complete dumb luck. In many cases with Sean Black's characters, whether it's like in The Long Kiss Goodnight or The Nice Guys or The Last Boy Scout, it's always like dumb luck with the characters. I appreciate that about his films, is that he has excellent timing. That's why I have to emphasize also, he seems to have mastered the whole slapstick comedy alongside with, like, I would say, gun ballet of people like John Woo. He seems to have been the only kind of American director I've seen to do this with precision. Like, I haven't seen too
Sure.
many other like American directors that can take stuff like from The Killer and from The Better Tomorrow and actually have these like symphonies with guns, but at the same time have this comedic sort of performance from the actors. So, and I saw a lot of this in like The Nice Guys, and that especially resonates in early on in the film when you're introduced to Russell Crowe's character. I think his name is Jackson Healy in the film.
Yep.
And in this film, like, these two goons go up to where like he's like in his apartment, and it's just they get like sideswiped by the Jackson Healy character, and the tables get turned pretty easily on them, and then something buffoonish happens, like the dye pack just like explodes right in their face, and this guy's called Blueface for the rest of the movie. One of the goons, along with Keith David, Keith David's character.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was great that he had Keith David in it too.
Oh yeah, he's a great actor.
Great 80s character actor from action films.
Also, addition to that, like the opening sequence of this film is one of the best openers I've seen in a while, where you have like the porn star, and she's sitting there naked, and this kid is like going for her. And I have to say that there's a lot of like inappropriate stuff in this film
You think?
with children.
But I think it
and
captures that
pornography.
era of Los Angeles perfectly, right? Like,
yeah, I mean,
kids
it's
looking at a porno
it's not
magazine.
historically inaccurate, though. I will say.
Yeah. I was just saying, just some of the sequences are kind of.
Oh yeah, I think this
they're not very
comment right here, the
all.
costumes and retro design too. I think as you speak to the opening sequence, I mean, that's a great opening sequence of kind of the early 1970s Hollywood Hills. You have this pornography star, that's in an era where pornography is still a burgeoning industry, right? And this is a kid who's, obviously a young teenager coming of age. He's got his porno mag out late at night in the house, and suddenly the porn star that he's looking at comes driving into his living room, right?
In the living room.
Yeah,
and she said something like, "Give it to me, big boy," or something.
Which was the title of the pornography that they'd made.
Yeah,
kind of outing the scandal of the Detroit auto industry, right? So that's some very deep political elements.
Shadowing. Yeah, I like the shadowing. Like the shadowing of like later in the story, which is very kind of a noir type of trope also as well. The way it foreshadows a lot of the things that occur later in the film. And yeah, like you mentioned, the whole like environment, they even have the environmentalism and the whole gridlock that was caused from Carter's America and the inflation and like the crisis at the gas pump. The killer bees also like figure very prominently in this film, often as a comedic device.
Well, yeah, that's kind of like the MacGuffin of the film, almost, right? Like the bee.
Yeah.
They're, even down to the point where they have the actual hallucination with the bee. I mean, it's
That was very masterfully done towards the end of the film.
I think it captured a lot of the elements of kind of what is often considered as the the deep state corporatocracy of America, between elements of like the Detroit auto industry, the mafia,
which goes back to Henry Ford, by the way. Henry Ford hiring goons to stop like labor unions. That goes really deep into like Detroit politics.
Sure.
I didn't mention that on the podcast, but Henry Ford was not only steeped into like Nazism during World War II, he also was hiring a lot of like hired goons and turning them loose on like union representatives. And there was like kind of a war where he was taking these homegrown sort of domestic terrorist groups like the Black Legion, and he was employing them on his lot and policing a lot of his workers, which is kind of a paradox because Henry Ford actually did do a lot for, you know, African Americans, but it seems like he had a lot of weird contradictory views. Very, very strange man. He was for women's suffrage, but he supported, like, you know, Nazi Germany, and also supported like the breaking of the union. So that's a little intricate aspect.
Sure.
In like this film, really, really strange. But yeah, it touches upon some of the deep politics in the auto industry and the environmental industry.
Sure.
Matter of fact, one of the most.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, one of the most hilarious scenes, besides the obvious of like you know, Holly, which is Ryan Gosling's like daughter, saying, and he always telling her not to say and stuff. He actually,
Right.
when he goes to like the party, she says, "There's whores here," and they said and stuff. And then he doesn't correct her as saying, you know, "There's whores here." He just says, "Don't say and stuff."
Right.
And she's just sitting there casually at the party, just talking to a bunch of adult performers. But getting back to my point is that
she corrects one of those adult performers, right? She's the adult to the adult performer, right?
Yeah, she says, and don't say and stuff.
Yeah, don't say and stuff.
And one of the other, like, a more hilarious thing is where incidents in the film is where they're like at this place where they're doing like their demonstration in the 70s, which it highlights kind of the environmental activism was gaining height. People like Earth First, and some of these were like the embryonic kind of stages in a lot of like radical environmentalism. So there's like a scene where they're simulating death from like carbon emissions that's being you know, from like the factories, and, you know, indicting kind of the Ford Corporation, which I think the Detroit clearly the automotive company is clearly Ford or GM or one of those big kind of Detroit
the big three
companies.
Chrysler, GM. Ford.
So he's sitting there and they're trying to get information out of them, and they're saying, "Oh, we can't say anything." And there's this bickering like back and forth like scene between like Ryan Gosling, where they said he's always like offering people like $20.
Right.
One of them says, "I'll say something for $20." So it's just a all around hilarious movie.
Yeah.
Of all the implications.
Oh no, I think there's some great points, and to the point of the EPA stuff and the catalytic converter scandals that actually were real scandals. You have the same person involved in that. Kim Basinger's character, she's the U.S. attorney there in California, so she's involved in that scandal while simultaneously involved in the pornography scandal, and her daughter kind of is involved in both of those scandals, right? She's making the pornography to out her mother's other nefarious actions with the auto scandal. What are some of your thoughts on that there?
Which believe it or not, I actually touched upon this in not specifically this point, but like what's interesting is that a lot of like environmental groups used porn to signal a lot of, I guess, what they saw environmental injustices and corruption or whatever. So it is like a common tactic. There was a thing called "fuck for forest," which was like being used by some Norwegian environmental group where these people are having, they were shooting these pornos in order to gain money for protection of the environment. So it's kind of interesting.
This sounds like that scandal out of New York, Nick, with the squirrel that got murdered there. The squirrel and the raccoon. The couple were running some sort of non-profit Save the Animals, but they were running an OnlyFans page.
Oh, and they were connected to the Fuck for Forest. The Fuck for Forest was also connected to an acting troupe as well, a theater group. Yeah.
They had hands in a lot of pots, huh?
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, what were some of your thoughts maybe on the some of the nice guys, or some of maybe the deep state elements where you got the U.S. attorney and the Kim Basinger character kind of being involved in all of these different scandals that are going on that are kind of tormenting the protagonist here. She's kind of an antagonist, but she's kind of tormenting the protagonist of the whole film.
Well, I appreciate the nuance to her character as well, because she really doesn't see herself as a villain, and
not at all.
She does make a very compelling case as to why she's not a villain at the end of the movie. Essentially, she is trying to stall or hold off, even more ravenous interests ultimately.
Sure.
So I think that that's one of the more compelling parts of this movie, is it sort of shows the complexity of things. You don't get really just like a clear-cut villain at the end of the film that can easily be disposed of, but really a broader system of corruption that's almost insurmountable in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's a darker thought, that's for sure, right? The insurmountable corruption that is proposed with some of her statements.
And I Doc had brought this up in the podcast, but I also thought the notion of the John Boy character, as being a Mormon, is an interesting one as well.
Oh.
Because, again, we had just talked about this before, but this is kind of getting back into the time of the Mormon Mafia when they were moving in on Las Vegas. Of course, there's a lot of discussion in the film about the Vegas mob breaking into the pornographic industry in LA, and the nice guys, certainly with the name John Boy, the way he dresses, the way he doesn't curse, you could
very straight
definitely see that.
Yeah, he seems very straight edge, right? Very straight edge.
Yeah,
very
you
straight
definitely
edge.
see him possibly as being meant to be a stand-in for a Mormon.
That's a very good point. I didn't even consider that, but I like it.
Yeah, so that's kind of another really interesting dynamic to this. And I think this is also around the time too where the LDS really started to make a big push to get into the film industry as well, kind of like the late 70s, early 80s. Obviously, well, they had already been involved in the film industry. Really going back to the beginning. They helped set up Paramount for pity's sake.
Sure.
But a revival, I suppose, around the late 70s.
Yeah, you're talking like peak Osmond era of the Mormon entertainment, right? In the mid 70s, when that the Osmonds run, that was kind of their era, right?
Well, I think they also started to become more involved directly in like in production studios and stuff.
Financing
time was around, if I remember correctly.
Interesting. No, it's an interesting. I like that thought though with John Boy for sure. Nick, have you?
Let me also emphasize. Let me also emphasize that the pornography aspect can't really be understated in this film, because we've seen other films like Paul Schrader's Hardcore touched upon this topic, how organized crime was being heavily involved and shooting pornography and using it as a cover and a front, and this is probably what was going on in this situation, even if the daughter was involved with pornography as an activist, kind of act. It still seems like the intersection of pornography and Hollywood is very much at play here, and apparently also big automotive industries involved as well. And
I think that's the point. Because so much, women are coerced, especially into doing pornography back in this era, on the basis that it was, this was a form of art or a form of rebellion, or it was for some political cause or something like that. And it's just no, when you really get down to it, it's just for the same criminal elements that are trying to exploit you.
Sure. For sure. Yeah, I can't really think. Those are the great points, fellas. I really can't think of any occult. Trying to think if Nick, you haven't seen this, and I can't think of any occult aspects necessarily to this narrative or storyline. How about you, Doc? Do you think of the occult nature of this one?
Nothing specifically in the occult, to be honest. Yeah. But I did enjoy the scene where I think they're swimming in the swimming pool with the Nixon mask.
Oh, with the Nixon story?
That was pretty good. That was a pretty good touch.
That story is a great story in the film when he's trying to describe what looking at things from a different perspective. Some people, when they're dying, they're expecting to see an angel, and instead they get Nixon.
Yeah, that was a good touch in this film.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, again, and that's an era where Nixon was certainly not. The storylines at the time where Nixon's certainly not a popular character, despite being a popular president in the election cycles. He wasn't a popular character.
Yeah, from what I understand, he cinched nearly every state. He's been one of the few presidents to do that.
Oh yeah,
he won a commanding victory in '72. McGovern, I think only won. Yeah, McGovern didn't even win his home state, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the only state he didn't win was Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken, but he nearly cinched it.
I thought one of the aspects, Nick, that I think you might enjoy about this film, and something we've discussed in the past, is the Comedy Store, right? So the Comedy Store there in Hollywood plays a role as the environmental role, as far as the numerous scenes take place at the Comedy Store. Russell Crowe's character lives on the second floor of the Comedy Store. So the scene earlier the doc was describing with the two the gangster assassin fellas coming in there, Keith David and the Blueface fella coming in there. They come into the Comedy Store. There's actually a scene that they show the comedian on stage as Russell Crowe's walking through there. The film actually ends there, showing a scene just outside the Comedy Store. So they do, speaking to the statement we had earlier from the chat, they do a great job at capturing that era of Hollywood, Sunset Boulevard, the Comedy Store in general. As you can see kind of here in the movie poster. But yeah, as far as I know, that's something we've discussed as far as kind of the weird scenes inside the Comedy Store, kind of a Dave McGowan look at aspects of the Comedy Store in Hollywood. I think that's something you and I have discussed it kind of doing podcasts on in the future. But yeah, it's an interesting element of this storyline is that the numerous scenes take place there at the Comedy Store.
I also want to now that I think of it, there are some occultic elements at the party. The porno party, the swinger party, or whatever, the sex party that they're on the rooftop.
Sure.
Which, by the way, was filmed in Atlanta, not L.A., probably because of cost, and there's more tax
incentives.
Yeah, for filming in Atlanta these days.
Oh yeah,
it's a preferable kind of location for a lot of people. But if you notice, the mermaid figures prominently, and if you also notice, there was a scene in there. There was a scene in there also with the one-horned unicorn, which is reminiscent of, I think Stephen made this point about Church of the All Worlds, and also like the Leonard Lake and
the appearance of the unicorn, I think, was
and the Ira Einhorn, as well.
Oh,
so yeah,
I thought that was an interesting touch, and I thought maybe Shane Black might be reading people like Dave McGowan and looking into some of the aspects of like Leonard Lake and Charles Ang and some of the Church of the All World type of cults that existed at that time. And they definitely would have been at some, I would imagine, because of Robert Heinlein's kind of his proclivities towards orgies. They probably would have been at places like that.
The Church of All World was actually based on Stranger in a Strange Land. That was
oh really? Was it really? Okay.
Yeah, Heinlein wasn't a diddler, but he was into lots of orgies and swinging.
I'll take your word for it. It seemed like that whole sci-fi club was into the diddling. I don't know about his buddy Isaac Asimov, but Isaac Asimov Jr. Largest child porn collection in American history.
I will say yes, but I don't know Heinlein's past that well, but I will say he's probably of all the sci-fi writers.
Clark would be another one in that group, right?
Yeah, he's a weirdo. Yeah, I'll just say there does seem to be certain proclivities towards sci-fi authors, but
there's another one I'm forgetting right now. Is a really, really aggressive one. It was basically no one really stood up for the guy except for Nambla, which is not exactly someone you want in your corner when you're up on some diddling charges.
That was the guy that I think was a part of the that Genius Society. I believe
Mensa.
He was in. Yeah, he was in Mensa.
There we go, Walter Breen. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I don't know. It seems to be a trend amongst a lot of sci-fi authors. I'm not saying all sci-fi authors. I'm just saying, I'm not willing to rule out Robert Heinlein just yet. But yes, weird orgies.
Okay. Sure. I'm skeptical about Robert Heinlein.
What were you saying?
No, what I was saying is that it definitely somebody of the Church of the All Worlds, considering their origin with Strangers in a Strange Land, they would most likely
that was connected. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's a swinger party. Yeah, it was a very counterculture novel, sci-fi novel during that time. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, William Ramsey and I did a analysis of that sci-fi story back when we were going over some of L. Ron Hubbard's sci-fi friends on his podcast.
It was a big. Heinlein was a big figure. Also, now he's considered kind of a saintly figure too, like a lot of libertarians.
Big time.
Libertarian movement.
Big time. Yeah, he's definitely venerated in that movement for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
Mm-hmm.
The hippies went for Stranger in a Strange Land. The libertarians went for The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
There you go. There you go, Recluse with the save on the sci-fi. Yeah, certainly some stuff I'm interested in, not necessarily something I have a lot of vast knowledge in, but yeah, I mean, some interesting characters there for sure, Heinlein included, and definitely he was very impactful on a number of groups.
And also potentially Ira Einhorn is also
Ira Einhorn, Charles Manson's friend.
Yeah.
And future and District Attorney of Los Angeles there in the 80s. I believe he prosecuted the Cotton Club murders.
He was like kind of a counterculture, like hippie murderer.
During his nickname was the Unicorn. He was he was actually tied in with Adrena Puharich. He was essentially the figurehead for what was it, the Psychic Mafia or something like that.
Oh, I'm thinking of a different guy then. Who's Ira Einhorn?
Yeah, different guy.
Different guy. Okay, different. Well, I think they're both named Ira Einhorn, to be honest with you.
But I do. I just think that
what's this Ira Einhorn?
Is interesting. He was a guy that I think murdered his girlfriend and kept her.
Holly Maddox. He dismembered her body and left it in a trunk in Philadelphia, and then he was he got a lot of funding actually from the Brofman family. They, if I remember correctly, it assisted him in fleeing the United States. He was hiding out in France until the late 90s, I believe, when he was finally extradited.
Do you know Polanski?
I don't know.
That'd be a weird little intersection over there in France, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
couple
petters hiding out over there in France together. One of which definitely sounds like a pretty psychopathic killer.
Well, there's no evidence that he was involved with like a Ira Einhorn. That is to say,
Einhorn didn't do the diddling; he just did the murdering.
Yeah, he just killed his.
I'm not sure if either one's better, to be quite honest with you.
One thing's for sure, though, like the whole one horn kind of unicorn type of motif that was very popular at the time seemed to be circulating around, where all these weird serial killers and these cultists really kind of intersects with Ira Einhorn was doing at the time. So I just thought that was interesting that Shane Black interjected that in like the movie, and most likely he has to know about it.
Sure, yeah, I think he certainly has some. Well, given what we've discussed here tonight, as far as some of the Shane Black narratives and storylines he's produced, it seems like he has a deeper understanding of a lot of conspiracy culture, parapolitical tropes that we've identified here, and probably more like you're saying with some of these serial killers. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, gents, I'd like to thank you all for joining me here. Can I maybe get some go around the horn here with some closing statements? I'll starting off here with Nick. And Nick, I think you've left with a lot of some good, and folks at the interwebs, a lot of good movie recommendations. Yeah. Hopefully, based upon the discussion here tonight.
Yeah, I'll definitely check out some of these movies. I got time to do that stuff right now. So, yeah, but thanks for having me on. Unfortunately, I couldn't say much about too many of these movies except for The Big Lebowski, but.
No, for sure. No, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us here. Recluse, Doc, can I get some closing comments from both of you gents here? And appreciate your all's time and joining us here for the Stoner Noir discussion. I definitely appreciate it. I think I definitely enjoyed it. I think there's a lot of information we've discussed, and hopefully in an entertainment fashion for folks here this evening. But yeah, over to you folks here for some closing comments and statements.
Yeah, I'll let Steve go. Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to discuss Stoner Noir. Like I was saying, it's a much funner topic to go over than a lot of the things we normally talk about. So that's
for sure. No, for sure. Well, appreciate your time there, Steven. Definitely great conversation.
I want to thank you, JJ, for bringing me on to talk about these subjects and for providing a platform to talk about these subjects, and
anytime.
Hopefully we've covered Stoner Noir and the greater implications of some of the parapolitical intersection with Stoner Noir and some of the aspects of these films that we discussed, such as Inherent Vice, The Big Lebowski, and The Long Goodbye, and Shane Black's movies of The Long Kiss Goodnight, and also the Nice Guys. I hope we've covered this fairly well, and we've provided a concise overview of what Stoner Noir is.
I think we have. Yeah,
as hard as it is to kind of explain what Stoner Noir is, I think we did a pretty decent job in that. And I just want to thank all the panel for contributing.
Appreciate it. No, it's good stuff. And for folks of interwebs, I highly recommend some additional content here on some of these subjects, be it true crime. Nick and myself have done number of countless hours, it seems like, of true crime discussions over on the Occult Rejects. I highly recommend those discussions. And as far as some of the more Stoner Noir stuff or other parapolitical conspiracy culture topics, myself and the Doc and Stephen here, Recluse, we've got a number of conversations on various secret societies, parapolitical stuff, and on Operation GCD and Stoner Noir, further analysis on some of the Stoner Noir topics that are on the farm between myself over there and the Doc joining Recluse for those conversations. So highly recommend those folks and of the interwebs, check those out and check out these films here if you haven't seen them. Some well-written films, some great comedy, and as we've discussed here tonight, contains a lot of parapolitical and conspiracy culture aspects in the storyline. So definitely a great conversation, dudes, and appreciate your all's time. And folks of the interwebs, appreciate your all's time and comments here in the chat. Always appreciated. So appreciate your all's time. Catch y'all next time.
Take a virtual bong hit.
Virtual bong hit.
A literal one. Or a literal one.
Nice.
Well, that's it. That's the show here, folks. So the next time you're out on the town, visiting your local watering holes, or perhaps just meandering around, and you hear the unmistakable sounds of metal clanking, and you spot signs of a disturbance, well, check your six. Look in that garbage can, 'cause you never can tell. The GCDs may be loose in your town.